Canada's Challenge 2: Understanding Our Borders. I'm David Watts. Borders are every bit as much expressions of energy as the trade, identity, and movement that they restrain as latent energy, or the flow of people, goods, and ideas that goes on within or across them as kinetic energy. Look at the current exchange of attitudes and views across the Alberta-BC border and within and among borders of the various First Nations along the coast and in British Columbia's interior. In this episode, I'll be focusing on the dynamics of borders rather than laws and security measures that maintain them. Trump's Wall, Hadrian's Wall, and the Great Wall of China may be wonders of the world and visible from outer space, but they're consensual as much as material achievements. Before I look at the past and present of Canada's international borders, it's useful to look at examples of changes to our internal borders that led to new provinces, territories, districts, and First Nations treaty land. The 1784 separation of New Brunswick from Nova Scotia took place 7 years before Quebec, a British province in 1774 extending along the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes to Windsor and Detroit, was divided into Lower and Upper Canadas. Both divisions followed natural geographic features. The mainline maritime provinces are joined and separated by the Isthmus of Chignecto, where the Nova Scotia landmass, part of the North African plate that drifted across the Atlantic, nestled up against the North American landmass. The space between the two filled with the mud of the Tantramar marshes. The two Canadas both lie along the St. Lawrence and are divided by the Ottawa River, older and deeper than the St. Lawrence, north of where the two rivers join west of the island of Montreal. Both political divisions were made in response to human migration. English-speaking refugees, United Empire Loyalists, who opposed the American Revolution and who wanted to continue to live under the Crown. Some had been branded as traitors and ostracized by neighbors and lost property in the American colonies. They were different from Quebec's population that was largely French and Catholic, with a coterie of British officials and aristocrats who'd come to run the country since the British takeover. Dividing the provinces created separate areas for newcomers. It gave colonial administrators closer, more manageable units to work with. The divisions were colonial office decisions taken in the UK, but made on the advice of officials in the field, many who'd earlier served in the 13 colonies and were familiar with the characteristics of the newcomers. These two colonies, subdivided to become 4, later became the first provinces to join Confederation. Before their acquisition and subdivision by Britain, they were the regions of Acadie and Canada, 2/3 of New France. The other third part had been Louisiana, scouted by La Salle when he set off inland from Quebec and down the Mississippi, building forts that limited expansion of English colonies westward. The later toehold of Nouvelle-Orléans, New Orleans in English, that became the capital of Louisiana in 1722, was built by a transatlantic expedition of ships from La Rochelle, France. Though named after the Duke of Orléans, it's worth noting that the French city of Orléans was Joan of Arc's first victory in her campaign to expel the English from France and a turning point in the 100 Years' War. By the mid-1700s, France claimed the most territory in North America of the European colonial powers, surrounding Britain's 13 colonies on two sides. Attacks from Quebec to the south and from Mississippi forts to the east by the French and their indigenous allies terrorized English settlers on farms and villages. Civilian men, women, and children were collateral damage, as we can see in early stories of Quebec when it was on the receiving end of English-backed Haudenosaunee Iroquois raids. This situation shaped British Prime Minister William Pitt Sr.'s policy to destroy New France in the 7 Years' War, not to gain more territory that would have to be protected, but to end the threat to the 13 colonies. Expelling Acadians from Nova Scotia, destroying France's Louisbourg fortress that guarded the entrance to the St. Lawrence, then taking Quebec and Montreal. Pitt was successful in breaking France's North American empire, but his success backfired. No longer needing British protection from France and its indigenous allies, the 13 colonies now felt strong enough to rebel against taxes, some of which were attempts to reclaim the massive costs Britain had paid out in their defense. So it was that 35 years after the British set out to break French power in North America, delegates of the 13 colonies were in Paris, after a victory won by the intervention of a French fleet at Yorktown, and in negotiating the terms of their independence, hosted by their former French adversary turned ally. The Americans' goal was now to break the back of remaining British power in North America. This is a place to begin to look at Canada's boundaries with the United States that some believe have been definitive of our identity in the last 243 years, particularly those whose primary point of self-reference is that we're not American. In earlier times, we differentiated ourselves by saying we're not French and we're not British, though of course some of us have been all three along the way. We must remember that the United States of 2026 is not the US of 1783, just as Canada is not the Canada of the Quebec Act of 1774. If someone from today were to mention the 49th parallel to people back then, they'd shake their heads in bewilderment. Neither were transcontinental countries, and the border between them was irregular and farther south, following the 45th parallel at one point. The major border between the two ran through the Great Lakes. The United States' western boundary was the Mississippi River, while Quebec, soon to be rebranded as Upper and Lower Canada, ran to Windsor in the south, facing American Detroit, an interesting inversion as the U.S. side has a French name meaning narrows, and the Canadian city is south of the U.S. one due to a bend in the river. Yet the future Canada, including Hudson's Bay Rupert's Land, was close to being transcontinental. In the subarctic forest and brush along the Canadian Shield around the bay was a demographic and linguistic swath of Nahi-Albans, the French called les Cris, Cree, for the cry-like quality of their language. They comprised a number of variants: Eastern Cree, Moose Cree, Woodlands Cree, Swampy Cree, Plains Cree, Rocky Mountain Cree. Though their speech may not have been intelligible to each other, they were all parts of the Algonquin language family. And because of the profusion of lakes and interconnecting streams and rivers in their territory, they became masters of the birch bark canoe, guides, ferrymen for fur traders, both French and English, out of Montreal and Hudson's Bay cross-country. The negotiators of America's independence at Paris 1783 did not know these things. Like Canadians who live a short distance from the U.S. border and see the continent as a series of north-south formations with hops from Halifax to Boston, Toronto-Buffalo, Winnipeg to Minneapolis, and Calgary to Denver, and Canada as an attempt to defy geography rather than as an expression of it. So seeking to end British power in North America, they left in place the supply and contact chains that joined the remaining parts. Unaware of this geography and the diversity that springs from it, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay, America's brightest and best in Paris, made the assumption that Britain's remaining North American colonies, north of the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes, on the plains and west coast, would fall like ripe fruit into the U.S. basket, one by one, without a shot being fired. That metaphor works only if low-lying fruit is all you see, and if there's no horizontal netting below or above to hold the higher-level fruit. The earlier system of waterways and trails for a fur trade focused on reaching the Western Sea, later replaced by railways connecting with container ships on both oceans, is the east-west and global network that escapes the notice of our neighbor. They ignore the fact that Canada has long had two viable Class I transcontinental railways, while the U.S. is now attempting its first. The War of 1812-14 has been called the Second American Revolution, as the U.S. joined it to push back against British supremacy on the high seas. Like the 7 Years' War, when Canada passed from French to British administration, the North American action was part of a larger conflict playing out in Europe. Despite cross-border raids on both sides, British-Canadian forces burning Washington and U.S. ones burning Toronto, the war was a stalemate in North America with the border basically unchanged. The war did become a rallying point for patriotic feelings on both sides. The U.S. national anthem was written commemorating a coastal battle with Britain in 1814, and Canadians of both language groups rallied together with Indigenous people to resist invasions at Queenston Heights and Lundy's Lane, cited in verse 2 of Alexander Muir's 1867 song, The Maple Leaf Forever. In 1915, before negotiations ending the war were finalized, the British attacked New Orleans in reprisal for some actions in the Gulf of Mexico, but also, they claimed, as a foil to draw U.S. forces and prevent them from marching north into Canada again. Americans won this exchange hands down. A U.S. history teacher wrote the song The Battle of New Orleans that became a North American #1 hit in 1959, sung and danced to in schools in both Canada and the U.S. That failed battle from the British side, and Napoleon's plan to retake French Canada by coming up the Mississippi, are two documented reminders of others' interest in our land and resources. The settlement after the 1812-14 war led to the 1818 Convention that extended the northern border of the U.S. west of the Rocky Mountains. By the outbreak of the U.S. Civil War, Canada, by this time a united province with upper and lower parts temporarily cobbled together again, and the U.S. were expanding west. Some Americans were dreaming of northward expansion again. William Seward, a rival of Abraham Lincoln's for the presidency in the 1860 election, and later Lincoln's Secretary of State, purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867. He had earlier proposed an invasion of Canada to unite the Union and Confederate armies after the Civil War, knowing that Britain would not want to take on what had become the world's most powerful army. Lincoln vetoed the proposal, saying, "You don't heal the wounds of one war by starting another." One of the reasons behind Confederation, at least in the thinking of visionaries like Sir John A., was the Western Territories, in which Britain had interests going back 200 years. Apart from the Hudson's Bay Company, these did not have other patterns of business and industry, and even less of settlement. In the evolution of Acadie and Quebec, later the Maritime Provinces and the Canadas under the British, there were customs and patterns out of which later laws and governance structures emerged. The 1818 Convention between Britain and the United States drew the border between their territorial interests west along the 49th parallel from Lake of the Woods, Ontario to the Rocky Mountains. Beyond this, a zone of joint occupation existed north of the Columbia River to Russian Alaska. In these regions, there were no towns other than indigenous villages or camps, no teachers, magistrates, medical services beyond first aid basics in the forts, and a few missionaries. There was a shamanic tradition of wise men and women, midwives and healers in indigenous societies. Each trading fort had a chief factor, a chief trader, his second in command, and other workers to carry on the work of the company. The 1846 Oregon Treaty extended the U.S.-UK border through the mountains to the Pacific Ocean, then south to include all of Vancouver Island on the British side. Though there was an international boundary, then a British-American one, including Alaska, in place in North America the year Confederation came into effect, Canada did not have provinces or territories beyond the head of Lake Superior. On the east coast, the Maritime Provinces had the same boundaries they do now, but the Canadas, upper and lower, now Ontario and Quebec, were half their present size. Their northern reaches were parts of Hudson Bay land that fully encompassed the western prairies. British Columbia was a separate British colony, with its present borders running north to 60 degrees to halt expansion south by Alaska that had been owned by Russia. The Prairies Hudson's Bay Territory ran north to the Arctic coast. It was populated by First Nations, company traders and métis voyageurs, and missionaries of various denominations who would influence later Canadian society in a number of ways. The Hudson's Bay Company took a live and let live attitude to the native population without the degree of intervention of people's lives in health, education, and safety we've come to accept. This left space for far-seeing leaders to have major roles in shaping the quality of life in the provinces that would emerge on Indigenous land. Eastern Canadian settler societies had grown up over 200 years, which included participation in local government that led to sitting at the Confederation negotiating tables. With only 30 years from the arrival of settlers until provinces were set up, the West did not have this type of gradual development. Rapid growth meant shallower roots, with those who could make it in homesteading, were others less stable, like one might find in a gold rush. Confederation was passed when the West was opened. Those who cushioned the effects of settlement on their peoples, provided stability, and reduced the risk of violence between populations were local leaders who had been on the ground for years before. Of the many who could be cited, there are four, one from each of the four future Western provinces I'll identify here. James Douglas was founder of the Vancouver Island Hudson's Bay Fort that solidified the international border and eventually became the colony's governor. When gold in the Cariboo drew in Americans, Douglas set up the colony of British Columbia to keep order on the mainland. His indigenous roots, his mother was Creole, his life partner Amelia Connolly was Cree, gave him standing with First Nations. Crowfoot, a fearless warrior in youth, became a peacemaker and elder statesman of the Blackfoot Confederacy. He built consensus with fellow chiefs that led to the signing of Treaty 8. When the survey for Canadian Pacific ran through his People's Reserve, he restrained his braves from violence until a lieutenant governor of the territories came to offer further land to compensate for the rail corridor. He refused Lakota's Sitting Bull's call to join a war of extermination against whites and remain neutral in Riel's 1885 uprising, sparing Alberta and Canada from the type of race wars that were taking place in the U.S. Piapot set up camp across the oncoming CP right-of-way in protest of failure to uphold treaty promises. Having made his point, he allowed his camp to be moved by 2 Mounties and led his people to a new reserve on Round Lake. His warriors wanted to fight. Piapot remained calm and prevented bloodshed. Louis Riel is the most controversial of our 4 leaders. His first Red River uprising led to Manitoba's admission on negotiated terms as a province rather than being annexed as a territory. His second Saskatchewan uprising was outside the law, Canadian sovereignty in the territories having by then been clearly established. Yet ironically, it saved Canadian Pacific and a transcontinental country. CP's moving troops to suppress it turned Ontario in favor of a parliamentary loan to complete the line. It may also have affected the map. A plan for provinces between Manitoba and the mountains had a north-south division like the Dakotas, where a northern province with a large francophone population would have been bilingual. A reaction of no more French provinces favored the present Alberta-Saskatchewan split, so English-speaking settlers in the south of both would outnumber French speakers. The 1867 Constitution Act provided for admission of further provinces and territories to the Federation. With the exception of Prince Edward Island, that had hosted the first Confederation Conference, then opted out and asked to be readmitted in 1872, and British Columbia that had existed as a colony beforehand, Sir John was in no hurry to create new provinces in the West. This was not anti-Western bias, for Sir John served as Victoria's MP to strengthen its connection to the East before there was a rail connection. Rather, like other fathers of Confederation, Sir John had watched the rapid creation of new states, slave and free, in the run-up to the U.S. Civil War, as North and South sides each tried to gain an advantage. In Canada, the major division was not slavery that had been abolished before Confederation, but between Roman Catholic Quebec and Protestant Ontario. Macdonald wanted the West to be able to develop sufficient population, culture, and traditions of its own, so new provinces created there would counterbalance and stabilize the Ontario-Quebec tension rather than transplanting Eastern issues into the West. Forcing Sir John's hand in Manitoba, as Riel did, came at a cost. The new province lacked a land base and water link needed for a viable economy, though this was later corrected by changing the map to add a coastline. And it did not control its resources, which became a precedent for other prairie provinces until 1930. We end with Macdonald's having opened the West with a handicap. In the next episode, we'll see how this became more acute under Laurier. We'll also look at Canada's coastal and northern boundaries, the landforms that underlie our country, and how they manifest in the diversity of our peoples. For Canada's Challenge, I'm David Watts.
When our western boundary was fixed at 49, it cut Point Roberts, but Vancouver Island stretched the line. The islands of the Gulf were left to learn their fate, till Kaiser Wilhelm drew the line across the Georgia Strait. Brit and Yankee agents met in Washington, D.C. to barter off our fishing rights, and there they could agree. The Gulf remained a mystery they left to arbitrate, till Kaiser Wilhelm drew the line across the Georgia Strait. The Hudson's Bay on Bellevue, what the Yankees called San Juan, built a post, pastured sheep, and tried to settle down. It said the Yanks were squatters until a later date, when Kaiser Wilhelm drew the line across the Georgia Strait. Yankee troops took up position, British warships came in close, in the battle over Griffin's Pig off an island on the coast. Then the U.S. Civil War began, the islands had to wait, till Kaiser Wilhelm drew the line across the Georgia Strait. The Kaiser ruled in 72, the British troops backed off. Within a month or more, all was quiet on the Gulf. Bellevue Island was awarded to the evergreen new state, when Kaiser Wilhelm drew the line across the Georgia Strait. "45 years later, the peace all came undone, and those the Kaiser settled went to war against his son. Berlin, Ontario changed its name in a wave of fear and hate, but the Kaiser's line still held out west across the Georgia Strait. Now islanders on both sides today are a quiet lot. They spin their wool, cut their glass, and fire only pots. But a pie for an exile neighbor is a customs bill of freight, since Kaiser Wilhelm drew the line across the Georgia Strait. Now I'm a laid-back islander doing fine, since Kaiser Wilhelm drew the line. Now, if you take your holidays on Pender or on Maine, then go to Friday Harbor, you've crossed the line again. That undefended border our people celebrate, since Kaiser Wilhelm drew the line across the Georgia Strait. How do you find an influence so very far away, where Flugelhorn and Luftwaffe have never seen the day? But the line between the isles of the Gulf and of San Juan is a toast to Wilhelm next time you feast on a Kaiser bun.
Ach du lieber Augustin, 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 ach du lieber Augustin, alles ist hin.
Canadians are go-betweens wherever there's a fuss. We try to do for others what the Kaiser did for us. We steer around the hotheads and try to mediate, like Kaiser Wilhelm did for us across the Georgia Strait. When Kaiser Wilhelm drew the line across the Georgia Strait.